Point out, you write this book from a perspective of a father. You have a 5-year-old son yourself.
Yeah, my son's turning 5 in 2 weeks. Hi Maxwell.
Hi, Maxwell.
Blake Lively entered the courtroom with the confidence of someone who believed every detail had already been secured in her favor. With Ryan Reynolds at her side, the support of a major newspaper echoing her version of events, and quiet encouragement from Hollywood's most influential circles, she seemed certain that Justin Baldoni would remain silent, concede, and allow her strategy to prevail. Yet she was gravely mistaken. Only days earlier, the case had taken an unexpected turn, one capable of unraveling everything she thought was firmly in place. Late on Friday, the newspaper involved in the matter submitted a motion asking the court to issue a final judgment in its favor. On the surface, it looked like a victory. In reality, it granted Baldoni and Wayfair Studios the opening they needed to pursue an appeal. Blake's most powerful ally had, unintentionally, presented Baldoni with exactly the opportunity he had been waiting for, and he acted immediately, securing the representation of Alexander Shapiro, a renowned appellate barrister, former clerk to a Supreme Court justice, and a specialist in overturning even the most daunting dismissals. He is the sort of advocate one hires only when one intends to fight the case at the highest possible level. Baldoni's decision sent a clear message to the court, the press, and to Blake herself. He was not retreating, he was escalating. And this was only the beginning. The first fractures in Blake's position emerged from the very institution she had believed would bolster her. That same Friday, the newspaper's legal team sought to finalize its exit from the case. Yet their urgency revealed how precarious the situation truly was. Large organizations do not rush to close proceedings unless they sense risk, pressure, or vulnerabilities that an appellate court might later scrutinize. Months earlier, the newspaper had published what it described as Blake's formal complaint against Baldoni and Wayfair Studios, presenting it online as if it were an official court filing. In truth, it had been nothing more than a draft unsigned, incomplete, and confidential under Californian law, framed to appear authentic. By presenting it as a legitimate legal document, the publication blurred the line between fact and assumption, venturing into highly questionable territory and creating potential exposure for itself. That looming uncertainty explains why it moved so quickly to shut the door, before Baldoni's legal challenge could spotlight the weaknesses. And, in attempting to protect itself, the newspaper inadvertently abandoned Blake altogether. Originally, the narrative crafted around the situation painted Baldoni as the unambiguous villain and Blake as the wronged party, a woman allegedly subjected to harassment and professional mistreatment. That framing was pushed so aggressively and with such confidence that many simply accepted it as truth. Yet, in their most recent filing, something extraordinary happened. Something no one expected. The very publication that once amplified Blake's claims quietly shifted their position, now acknowledging that much of the tension did not stem from harassment at all, but from ordinary creative disagreements, disputes over the film's direction, discomfort surrounding intimacy scenes, and clashing opinions about marketing strategies. It was a subtle line in a legal document, but its implications were enormous. With that single admission, the foundation of Blake's story began to crumble. Her entire narrative, one built on the premise that she had been targeted, mistreated, and subjected to inappropriate behavior, suddenly looked less like a plea for justice and more like the fallout of a Hollywood power struggle. What she had described as harassment now appeared, through the lens of this revised framing, to be frustration at not maintaining complete control over the production. This shift didn't merely weaken her claims, it fundamentally redefined them, and the ripples reached far beyond Blake herself. Ryan Reynolds, who had vocally supported his wife and made public jabs at Baldoni, now found his role cast in a different light. What once seemed like a spouse defending his partner began to resemble an attempt to leverage celebrity influence against a co-star turned director who refused to bend to their preferences. The optics had changed. Instead of appearing protective, the couple now risked being viewed as using their Hollywood stature to sway public opinion and pressure industry peers. With the newspaper's filing undermining the very spine of Blake's case, Baldoni's legal team now had a strategic advantage. The cracks were widening and they intended to prise them open. Their first target, Blake's so-called lawsuit, drafted a document that had become the biggest bombshell of the entire affair. When the New York Times published Blake's allegations, they presented them with full theatrical weight, as though they were unveiling an authentic legal complaint. The headline declared, "Read Blake Lively's complaint against Wayfair Studios." The document itself looked impeccably official, bold headings, formal structure. Blake identified as the plaintiff, Wayfarer as the defendant, and damages listed prominently. Any ordinary reader would have assumed it was an actual court filing. It bore every outward sign of legitimacy, except it wasn't legitimate at all. In truth, it wasn't filed anywhere. It wasn't signed. It wasn't final. It didn't even contain a proper prayer for relief. Instead, trailing off abruptly because it wasn't a lawsuit, but merely a draft, a private, incomplete document never intended for public release. Shaped to resemble a legal filing without possessing any legal status whatsoever, it was a theatrical prop in the guise of a legal weapon. This distinction is critical. Under United States law, Journalists enjoy broad protections when reporting on genuine public records, real court documents, government investigations, or official complaints. But Blake's draft wasn't public. It wasn't even permitted to be disclosed. In California, civil rights filings are protected by strict confidentiality rules. They are meant to remain private between the parties and the agency handling the matter. By publishing it as if it were a legitimate lawsuit, the Times stepped beyond the boundaries of fair reporting and into the realm of misrepresentation. A dangerous move that stripped them of the journalistic privilege they normally rely on. And misrepresentation is precisely what gives Baldoni's appeal momentum. If a publication presents an unofficial confidential draft as an official court filing, the legal protections shielding journalists can evaporate. That means Blake's carefully crafted narrative and all the public support it generated is suddenly at risk of collapsing in full view of the world. But that isn't the end of it. Not even close. Because the New York Times didn't stop at publishing the draft, they also included private text messages and emails, communications never part of any public record, never filed in court, and never authorized for release. They weren't reporting on evidence from proceedings or materials obtained through public channels. They were publishing private exchanges, almost certainly supplied directly by Blake or someone within her inner circle. That means the newspaper didn't merely step outside protected reporting. They knowingly walked straight past the boundaries, and that single decision could be the detonator that sets off the entire chain reaction. In defamation law, this sort of behavior is a blazing red warning sign. To prevail against a media giant of the Times' stature, Baldoni's legal team must meet the highest standard in American free speech jurisprudence: actual malice. That means proving the newspaper either knew the information it published was false or acted with reckless disregard for whether it was true. Publishing a confidential, unfinished draft dressed up to resemble a formal lawsuit and pairing it with private, non-public messages unquestionably edges towards the territory courts have long considered reckless. And this isn't unprecedented. Courts have allowed cases with far less dramatic facts to move forward. Consider the Sarah Palin case against the Times. Although she ultimately lost at trial, her lawsuit advanced on appeal precisely because there were questions over whether the paper had acted negligently or worse. The appeals court emphasized that judges must be cautious about dismissing such cases prematurely when there is even a hint that a media outlet may have crossed ethical or legal boundaries. This legal history is exactly why Baldoni's challenge poses a far more serious threat than Blake and Ryan ever anticipated. For them, this scenario is nothing short of a nightmare. Because once discovery begins in earnest, the spotlight won't linger solely on the Times. It will widen to encompass every individual involved in shaping the narrative. And that includes Blake herself. Every email, every text message, every draft, every internal discussion she participated in could be held into the open. And the more the Times attempts to justify its publication by pointing to the material supplied by Blake or her representatives, the more tightly she becomes entwined with the entire smear campaign narrative that Baldoni's team is alleging. This intersects directly with the sanctions motion. Blake and Ryan submitted a move demanding that the judge penalize Baldoni and Wayfair Studios harshly, impose significant financial punishments, and officially declare Blake the uncontested victor. But sanctions depend on one condition: that her case appears pristine, solid, and unquestionably credible. If Baldoni demonstrates on appeal that the Times mishandled confidential material, misrepresented a private draft, or acted recklessly, then the foundation of Blake's argument dissolves beneath her. Her story, built upon that draft and the selectively released private communications, risks being recast as a strategic construction rather than an authentic plea for justice, and her sanctions request would no longer resemble a righteous pursuit of accountability. It would look like an opportunistic strike, a calculated attempt to extract a victory by force rather than fact. Ryan Reynolds, who has stood firmly at Blake's side, publicly mocking Baldoni and leveraging his celebrity aura to reinforce her narrative, would find himself drawn into the same net. If discovery precedes his emails, private exchanges, strategic conversations, and any evidence of back-channel coordination with media outlets could become fair game. The image of a supportive spouse could rapidly shift to that of a powerful Hollywood figure using influence to shape a narrative, silence a colleague, or amplify a smear. Courts, journalists, and the public alike would pay close attention to any indication that Ryan's role extended beyond mere moral support. This escalating risk explains why the Times appears desperate to secure a final judgment as quickly as possible, and why Blake is attempting to push the judge into granting her victory before Baldoni's appeal gains serious traction. Because if the appeal goes forward, and especially if Baldoni prevails, it won't simply expose sloppy reporting or a poorly handled editorial choice. It has the potential to detonate Blake and Ryan's entire legal strategy, turning what once looked like a carefully orchestrated campaign into a catastrophic miscalculation that unravels under the weight of its own contradictions. Because once discovery begins, there is no shutting the door again. It is a one-way gate, and whatever emerges on the other side has the power to devastate an entire public image, an entire career, an entire career, an entire empire built on carefully curated perfection. That is precisely why Blake and Ryan are frightened. Discovery does not care about PR management, curated press releases, or Hollywood optics. It drags everything into the open, the polished statements, the private messages, the drafts, the conversations they never imagined anyone outside their circle would read. And once those documents surface, no amount of celebrity charm can push them back into the shadows. Baldoni, meanwhile, did not flinch. He did not wait. He did not retreat into silence. Instead, he surged forward and made a move that sent shockwaves through every corner of the case. He hired Alexander Shapiro, one of the most formidable appellate lawyers in the country, a legal mind who clerked for the legendary Supreme Court Justice Ruth Bader Ginsburg, served as a United States attorney and federal prosecutor, and has built a reputation on overturning dismissals that other lawyers would consider unwinnable. Lawyers of Shapiro's caliber aren't summoned for petty quarrels or low-stakes disputes. They are brought in when the battlefield has shifted from mere litigation to total legal warfare. His arrival signaled a clear message to Blake, to Ryan, and even to Judge Lyman. Baldoni is no longer playing defense. He's preparing to escalate the fight to its highest possible level, and judges dislike being overturned on appeal, which means every decision Judge Lyman makes from this point forward carries the lingering shadow of Shapiro's inevitable scrutiny. It is a masterstroke, a strategic maneuver that demonstrates Baldoni's foresight and determination. For Blake and Ryan, the situation is spiraling into the territory of their worst fears. They had relied on early court successes, on media support, and on their overwhelming Hollywood influence to keep the narrative in their favor. But now, for the first time, they face an opponent with the skill, the resources, and the legal firepower to defeat a media giant and, by extension, to dismantle the story they thought was unshakable. The battlefield is no longer the trial court they once controlled. It has moved to the appellate arena, where prestige, experience, and precision matter far more than celebrity. Behind the immaculate red carpet smiles and carefully polished public appearances, panic is setting in. The higher the stakes climb, the more transparent their desperation becomes. And the most telling sign of all is Blake Lively's sudden urgency in pressing the judge to declare her the outright victor and grant her heavy financial sanctions immediately. And consider this: if she truly believed her case was airtight, she would welcome the process. She would allow discovery to open, confident that nothing damaging would emerge. She would let Baldoni's appeal unfold naturally, certain it would fail. But she isn't doing any of those things. Instead, she is asking for shortcuts, demanding fast-tracked decisions, and urging the court to lock in a win before the next phase begins. That is not confidence, it is fear, and the timing reveals everything. Her demand for sanctions came in the same week the New York Times requested a final judgment, a clear sign that she anticipated an appeal and wanted to secure whatever she could before the walls began closing in. Meanwhile, Ryan Reynolds maintains his public persona as the witty, supportive husband, cracking jokes at Baldoni's expense, reinforcing Blake's narrative, and using his vast celebrity influence to keep the public on her side. But behind that facade lies a far darker reality. Should discovery open, every behind-the-scenes message, strategic exchange, or moment of coordination could place him squarely in the center of the storm. And if his private role differs from his public performance, the consequences could be far-reaching. Emails, phone calls, favors from Hollywood allies, whispered conversations with journalists for years. Ryan has relied on charm, charisma, and his carefully cultivated public persona to shield Blake from scrutiny. He has leaned on relationships, goodwill, and the starstruck loyalty of the entertainment machine to manage crises before they could ignite. But in a courtroom, charm holds no power. Judges are not dazzled by celebrity, and appellate courts even less so. The only currency that matters is evidence, cold, unyielding, impossible to reframe. And this is precisely what frightens them. Because once Baldoni's appeal moves forward, everything they worked so desperately to conceal, the staged draft complaint, the private texts, the back-channel discussions with reporters, the coordinated narrative building could explode into public view. Blake and Ryan have spent years controlling the story, orchestrating narratives, and shaping the headlines. But suddenly the story is no longer about control. It is about exposure, and exposure is the very thing their carefully curated public image cannot survive. What's even more alarming for Hollywood at large is that this appeal has the potential to change the industry's unwritten rules. This isn't simply about Baldoni clearing his name. It is about challenging the long-standing system that allows powerful celebrities to weaponize the media with almost no accountability. For years, the formula has been consistent. A star leaks a story, a compliant outlet publishes it without question, and the public swallows the narrative whole. Careers are destroyed long before the truth is allowed to surface. According to this fictional narrative, that was the strategy used against Baldoni: manipulate the press, to frame him using a fabricated complaint dressed up as a lawsuit, rely on Ryan's overwhelming star power to keep the narrative alive, and ensure the story spreads before anyone questions it. But if the appeal succeeds, discovery forces the truth into the open. The Times would have to address why it presented a confidential, unfiled draft as a legitimate court document and how it obtained private texts and emails that were never part of any public record. Once that facade begins to crack, the spotlight doesn't stay on the media, it swings rapidly and violently back towards Blake and Ryan. And the consequences extend beyond them. If an appellate court rules that a media outlet cannot hide behind fair report privilege when it mischaracterizes confidential material, it sends a shockwave through the entire industry. It creates a precedent that says you cannot dress up a celebrity's narrative as fact. You cannot run smear campaigns under the guise of reporting. You cannot act with impunity simply because your subject is powerful. That prospect terrifies Blake and Ryan, because it means the one thing they have relied on for years, control, may be slipping away. This fictional struggle suggests that losing the lawsuit is not their greatest fear. Losing their power to shape public perception is. Without that power, the flawless image they've worked so hard to maintain could begin to fracture, crumble, and collapse under scrutiny. And that is why this final showdown matters so much. The empire they built, an empire of image, influence, and narrative mastery, may be standing on the edge of a cliff. Justin Baldoni now has the legal firepower to overturn the case. The Times is scrambling to protect itself from the fallout. And Blake and Ryan are running out of corners to retreat to, out of narratives to spin, and out of allies willing to risk their own reputations. Now the question becomes, will Baldoni's appeal finally force the truth into the light? Or will Blake and Ryan manage to twist the narrative once more? The outcome will shape not only this battle, but the way Hollywood power plays are scrutinized and challenged for years to come.